Hello, everyone. Yesterday we picked up with Chapter 9, and there was all sorts of craziness. There was a group of what seemed to be dark wizards that were tormenting muggles. So Harry, Ron, and Hermione ran off into the forest. Then the Dark Mark, which is Voldemort's mark, was conjured above them. And suddenly 20 Ministry Wizards showed up and started firing spells at them. So they pointed out that there was somebody in the bushes, and that's where we left off. A few seconds later, they heard Mr. Diggory shout, "Yes, we got them! There's someone here! Unconscious! But, blimey!" "You've got someone?" shouted Mr. Crouch, sounding highly disbelieving. "Who? Who is it?" They heard snapping twigs, the rustling of leaves, and then crunching footsteps as Mr. Diggory re-emerged from behind the trees. He was carrying a tiny limp figure in his arms. Harry recognized the tea towel at once. It was Winky. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak as Mr. Diggory deposited Mr. Crouch's elf on the ground at his feet. The other Ministry Wizards were all staring at Mr. Crouch. For a few seconds, Crouch remained transfixed, his eyes blazing in his white face as he stared down at Winky. Then he appeared to come to life again. "This cannot be," he said jerkily. "No." He moved quickly around Mr. Diggory and strode off towards the place where he had found Winky. "No point, Mr. Crouch," Mr. Diggory called after him. "There's no one else there." But Mr. Crouch did not seem prepared to take his word for it. They could hear him moving around and rustling of leaves as he pushed the bushes aside, searching. "Bit embarrassing," Mr. Diggory said grimly, looking down at Winky's unconscious form. "Barty Crouch's house elf. I mean to say." "Come off it, Amos," said Mr. Weasley quietly. "You don't seriously think it was the elf. The dark mark's a wizard sign. It requires a wand." "Yeah," said Mr. Diggory, "and she had a wand." "What?" said Mr. Weasley. "Here, look." Mr. Diggory held up a wand and showed it to Mr. Weasley. "Had it in her hand. So that's a Clause 3 of the Code of Wand Use broken for a start. No non-human creature is permitted to carry or use a wand." Just then there was another pop, and Ludo Bagman apparated right next to Mr. Weasley. Looking breathless and disoriented, he spun on the spot, goggling upwards at the emerald green skull. "The Dark Mark," he panted, almost trampling Winky as he turned inquiringly to his colleagues. "Who did it? Did you get them, Barty? What's going on?" Mr. Crouch had returned empty-handed. His face was still ghostly white, and his hands and his toothbrush mustache were both twitching. "Where have you been, Barty?" said Bagman. "Why weren't you at the match? Your elf was saving you a seat, too. Gulping gargoyles." Bagman had just noticed Winky lying at his feet. "What happened to her?" "I've been busy, Ludo," said Mr. Crouch, still talking in the same jerky fashion, barely moving his lips. "And my elf has been stunned." "Stunned? By you lot, you mean? But why?" Comprehension dawned suddenly on Bagman's round, shiny face. He looked up at the skull, down at Winky, and then at Mr. Crouch. "No," he said. "Winky conjured the Dark Mark. She wouldn't know how. She'd need a wand for a start." "And she had one," said Mr. Diggory. "I found her holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself." Crouch made no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory, but Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence as assent. He raised his own wand, pointing it at Winky, and said, "Renervate." Winky stirred feebly. Her great brown eyes opened, and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silent wizard, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet and slowly, tremulously, raised her eyes to stare up into his face. Then more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Harry could see the floating skull reflected twice in her enormous glassy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked wildly around in the crowded clearing, and burst into terrified sobs. "Elf," said Mr. Diggory sternly, "do you know who I am? I'm a member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Winky began to rock backwards and forwards on the ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Harry was reminded forcibly of Dobby and his moments of terrified disobedience. "As you see, Elf, the Dark Mark was conjured here a short while ago," said Mr. Diggory, "and you were discovered moments later. right beneath it. An explanation, if you please.
I is not doing it, sir,
Winky gasped.
I is not knowing how, sir.
You were found with the wand in your hand, barked Mr. Diggory, brandishing it in front of her. And as the wand caught the green light that was filling the clearing from the skull above, Harry recognized it. Hey, that's mine, he said. Everyone in the clearing looked at him. Excuse me, said Mr. Diggory incredulously. That's my wand, said Harry. I dropped it. You dropped it? Said Mr. Diggory in disbelief. Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark? Amos, think who you're talking to, said Mr. Weasley very angrily. Is Harry Potter likely to conjure the dark mark? Of course not, mumbled Mr. Diggory. Sorry, carried away. I didn't drop it there anyway, said Harry, jerking his thumb towards the trees beneath the skull. I missed it right after we got into the woods. So, said Mr. Diggory, his eyes hardening as he turned to look at Winky again, cowering at his feet. You found this wand, eh, Elf? And you picked it up and thought you might have some fun with it, did you?
I is not doing magic with it, sir,
squealed Winky, tears streaming down the sides of her squashed and bulbous nose.
I is just picking it up, sir. I is not making the dark mark, sir. I is not knowing how.
It wasn't her, said Hermione. She looked very nervous, speaking up in front of all these ministry wizards, yet determined all the same. Winky's got a squeaky little voice, and the voice we heard doing the incantation was much deeper. She looked around at Harry and Ron, appealing for their support. It didn't sound anything like Winky, did it? No, said Harry, shaking his head. It definitely didn't sound like an elf. Yeah, it was a human voice, said Ron. Well, we'll soon see, growled Mr. Diggory, looking unimpressed. There's a simple way of discovering the last spell a wand performed, Elf. Did you know that? Winky trembled and shook her head frantically, her ears flapping, as Mr. Diggory raised his own wand again and placed it at the tip of Harry's. Prior incantato, roared Mr. Diggory. Harry heard Hermione gasp, horrified, as the gigantic serpent-tongued skull erupted from the point where the two wands met. But it was a mere shadow of the green skull high above them. It looked as though it was made of thick gray smoke, the ghost of a spell. Deletrius! Mr. Diggory shouted, and the smoky skull vanished in a wisp of smoke. So, said Mr. Diggory with a kind of savage triumph, looking down upon Winky, who was still shaking convulsively.
I is not doing it,
she squealed, her eyes rolling in terror.
I is not knowing how. I is a good elf. I isn't using wands. I isn't knowing how.
You've been caught red-handed, Elf, Mr. Diggory roared, caught with the guilty wand in your hand. Amos, said Mr. Weasley loudly, think about it. Precious few wizards know how to do that spell. Where would she have learned it? Perhaps, Amos is suggesting, said Mr. Crouch, cold anger in every syllable, that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark. There was a deeply unpleasant silence. Amos Diggory looked horrified. Mr. Crouch, not at all. You have now come very close to accusing the two people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure that mark, barked Mr. Crouch. Harry Potter and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the boy's history, Amos. Of course, everyone knows, muttered Mr. Diggory, looking highly discomfited. And I trust you remember the many proofs I have given over my long career that I despise and detest the dark arts and those who practice them, Mr. Crouch shouted, his eyes bulging again. Mr. Crouch, I never suggested you had anything to do with it, muttered Amos Diggory, now reddening behind his scrubby brown beard. If you accuse my elf, you accuse me, Diggory, shouted Mr. Crouch. Where else would she have learned to conjure it? She might have picked it up anywhere. Precisely, Amos, said Mr. Weasley. She might have picked it up anywhere. Winky, he said kindly, turning to the elf, but she flinched as though he too was shouting at her. Where exactly did you find Harry's wand? Winky was twisting the hem of her tea towel so violently that it frayed beneath her fingers. I is finding it there, sir, she whispered. There, in the trees, sir. You see, Amos, said Mr. Weasley, Whoever conjured the mark could have disapparated right after they'd done it, leaving Harry's wand behind. A clever thing to do, not using your own wand, which would have betrayed them. And Winky here had the misfortune to come across the wand moments later and pick it up. But then she'd have been feet away from the real culprit, said Mr. Diggory impatiently. Elf, did you see anyone? Winky began to tremble worse than ever. Her giant eyes flicked from Mr. Diggory to Ludo Bagman and to Mr. Crouch. Then she gulped and said, I have seen no one, sir, no one. Amos, said Mr. Crouch curtly, I am fully aware that, in ordinary course of events, you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her. Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was clear to Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. You may rest assured that she will be punished, said Mr. Crouch coldly. Master, Winky stammered, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, please. Mr. Crouch stared back, his face somehow sharpened, every line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. Winky, you have misbehaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible, he said slowly. I told you to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble, and I find that she has disobeyed me. This means clothes. No! Shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. No, master, not clothes, not clothes. Harry knew that the only way to turn a house elf free was to present it with proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. But she was frightened, Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. Your elf's scared of heights, and those wizards in masks were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out of their way. Mr. Crouch took a step backwards, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though she was something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me, he said coldly, looking up at Hermione. I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to her master and her master's reputation. Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent, if nobody's got any objections. Amos, that wand told us all it can. If Harry can have it back, please. Mr. Diggory handed Harry his wand, and Harry pocketed it. Come on, you three, Mr. Weasley said quietly, but Hermione didn't seem to want to move. Her eyes were still on the sobbing elf. Hermione, Mr. Weasley said, more urgently. She turned and followed Harry and Ron out of the clearing and off through the trees. What's going to happen to Winky? Said Hermione the moment they had left the clearing. I don't know, said Mr. Weasley. The way they are treating her, said Hermione furiously. Mr. Diggory calling her elf all the time, and Mr. Crouch. He knows she didn't do it, and he's still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been, or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't even human. Well, she's not, said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. That doesn't mean she hasn't got feelings, Ron. It's disgusting the way... Hermione, I agree with you, said Mr. Weasley quickly, beckoning her on. But now is not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as fast as we can. What happened to the others? We lost them in the dark, said Ron. Dad, why was everyone so uptight about that skull thing? We'll explain everything back at the tent, said Mr. Weasley tensely. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards was congregated there. When they saw Mr. Weasley coming towards them, many of them surged forward. What's going on in there? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him! Of course it's not him, said Mr. Weasley impatiently. We don't know who it was. It looks like they disapparated. Now excuse me, please. I want to go to bed. He led Harry, Ron, and Hermione through the crowd and back into the campsite. All was quiet now. There was no sign of the masked wizards, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of the boys' tent. Dad, what's going on? He called through the dark. Fred, George, and Ginny got back okay, but the others... I've got them here, said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bedsheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred, George, and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. "Did you get them, Dad?" said Bill sharply. "The person who conjured the mark." "No," said Mr. Weasley. "We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we're none the wiser who actually conjured the mark." "What?" said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. "Harry's wand?" said Fred. "Mr. Crouch's elf?" said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the woods. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. "Well, Mr. Crouch is quite right to get rid of an elf like that, running away when he'd expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would that have looked if she had been up in front of the Department for the Regulation and Control of—" "She didn't do anything. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken aback. Hermione had always gotten on fairly well with Percy, better indeed than any of the others. "Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand," said Percy pompously, recovering himself. "She didn't run amok," shouted Hermione. "She just picked it up off the ground." "Look, can someone just explain what that skull thing was?" said Ron impatiently. "It wasn't hurting anyone. Why is it such a big deal?" "I told you, it's you-know-who's symbol, Ron," said Hermione before anyone else could answer. "I read about it in The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts." "And it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley quietly. Of course people panicked. It was almost like seeing you-know-who back again. "I don't get it," said Ron. "I mean, it's only a shape in the sky." "Ron, you-know-who and his followers sent the dark mark into the air whenever they killed," said Mr. Weasley. "The terror it inspired, you have no idea. You're too young. Just picture coming home and finding the dark mark hovering over your house, and knowing about what you're about to find inside." Mr. Weasley winced. Everyone's worst fear. The very worst. There was silence for a moment. Then Bill, removing the sheet from his arm to check on his cut, said, "Well, it didn't help us tonight, whoever conjured it. It scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They all disapparated before we got near enough to unmask any of them. We caught the Roberts before they hit the ground, though. They're having their memories modified right now." "Death Eaters?" said Harry. "What are Death Eaters?" "It's what you-know-who's supporters called themselves," said Bill. "I think we saw what's left of them tonight, the ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban, anyway." "We can't prove it was them, Bill," said Mr. Weasley, "though it probably was," he added hopelessly. "Yeah, I bet it was," said Ron, suddenly. "Dad, we met Draco Malfoy in the woods. He good as told us that his dad was one of those nutters in the mask, and we all know the Malfoys were right in with you-know-who." "But what were Voldemort's supporters?" Harry began. Everybody flinched. Like most of the wizarding world, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. "Sorry," said Harry quickly. "What were you-know-who's supporters up to, levitating muggles? I mean, what's the point?" "The point?" said Mr. Weasley, with a hollow laugh. "Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us all that lots of them were still at large. A nice little reunion for them," he finished disgustedly. "But if they were Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the dark mark?" said Ron. "They'd have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they?" "Use your brains, Ron," said Bill. "If they really were Death Eaters, they worked really hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power. Told all sorts of lies about him, forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied they'd ever been involved with him when he lost his powers and went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be over pleased with him, do you?" "So, whoever conjured the dark mark," Hermione said slowly, "were they doing it to show support for the Death Eaters, or to scare them away?" "Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione," said Mr. Weasley. "But I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. Listen, it's very late, and if your mother hears what's happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours of sleep and then try and get an early port key out of here." Harry got back into his bunk with his head buzzing. He knew he ought to feel exhausted. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but he felt wide awake and worried. 3 days ago, it felt like much longer, but it had only been 3 days. He had awoken with his scar burning, and tonight, for the first time in 13 years, Lord Voldemort's mark had appeared in the sky. What did these things mean? He thought of the letter he had written to Sirius before leaving Privet Drive. Would Sirius have gotten it yet? When would he reply? Harry lay looking up at the canvas, but no flying fantasies came to him now to ease him to sleep. And it was a long time after Charlie's snores filled the tent that Harry finally dozed off. All right, tomorrow we will pick up with Chapter 10, Mayhem at the Ministry. I'll see you then.